So I'm going to start by thanking all of you for joining us for this very special tour of Grand Canyon. And I'm Mary Kershaw, Executive Director and CEO of the really wonderful Museum of Northern Arizona. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this virtual event. We're delighted to be able to bring the experience of this incredible part of the world directly to you in your own home, wherever you may be. And as Wayne has mentioned, there are people from all around the world joining us tonight and after. So that's really lovely, and I'm delighted you could join us. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I've been asked to just take a moment to share a few upcoming events, and this will mean more to those of you in the Flagstaff area. Journey to Balance, Migration and Healing in 3 Hopi Murals is a new exhibition that opens at MNA on November 19th. The museum, just to remind you, is open to the public and tickets need to be reserved in advance through our website. On 2 weekends in December, the 3rd to the 6th and the 10th to the 13th, join MNA, Flagstaff Arts Council, and Flagstaff Arts and Leadership Academy on each of our respective campuses. We'll have socially distanced opportunities to safely support local artists and Native artists at the Fort Valley Community Winter Art Market. That really will be quite something I'm looking forward to quite a lot. And please remember to like and follow MNA on Facebook and Instagram, and that way you'll be able to stay up to date with all of our future programming and events. And so that's the end of the advert, and without further ado, I'd like to both thank and introduce tonight's guest and wonderful friend of MNA, Wayne Ranney. Wayne's passion for Southwest geology took root during his years as a backcountry ranger in Grand Canyon. His association with MNA started in 1978 as a research assistant in the geology department. In 1982, he joined the Ventures program and continues to be a stalwart trip leader in Grand Canyon, Escalante, and other destinations. Wayne has traveled the world as a geologic interpreter aboard ships and jets, as well as on many natural history expeditions. He's been to Antarctica 30 times, I understand, the Amazon, the Canadian Arctic, Greenland, the Gobi Desert, the Russian Far East, and the North and South Poles, as a really, really quite remarkable Wayne. Although he has served as an adjunct faculty member at Yavapai College in Sedona, there's nothing Wayne enjoys more than teaching in an outdoor classroom. Wayne is an author who has written for various publications, including Amazon Highways, Sedona Magazine, and Earth Magazine. He has also written several books, including Ancient Landscapes of the Colorado Plateau, Carving Grand Canyon, and Sedona Through Time. Currently, Wayne is writing a geologic guide to the Colorado River in Grand Canyon. Wayne, thank you for your long and deep support of MNA, and especially thank you for tonight's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. It's a pleasure for me to be here representing the museum as I am. And as you said in that wonderful introduction, there's nothing I enjoy more than being outdoors in the American Southwest, even going to all those places like the high Arctic and the Amazon. I enjoy going to those places, but I enjoy coming home to Flagstaff. So as part of your pandemic entertainment tonight, we are going to take a virtual river trip in the Grand Canyon. I was fortunate enough to do 2 river trips in the canyon this year, and the first one was postponed from May 1st because of the pandemic, and we ran that trip the first week of August, and I've just returned this last month in October from a 17-day trip. The 7-day trip in August with the museum was a trip on a motorboat. I'll explain a little bit more about that on the river when we do the slideshow. And the 17-day trip, I went with my co-author for this geologic river guide that we're writing, and we volunteered for a vegetation crew to do some vegetation surveys in the Grand Canyon. So I'm fresh out of the ditch and full of excitement for the Grand Canyon. So I guess we better get started. We're going to take this virtual river trip down the Grand Canyon, and it is my pleasure to do this in conjunction with the Museum of Northern Arizona. And I'd like to introduce you to the Grand Canyon via a digital elevation map. The digital elevation map is something that is obtained by laser from spaceships. This is the digital elevation map. And up there in the upper right, you can see Lee's Ferry. And I'm marking off every 20-mile segment of this fantastic river trip in the Grand Canyon. And 280 miles downstream, you can see where many of the trips end at a place called Pierce Ferry. Both Lee's Ferry and Pierce Ferry are old ferry sites where wagons used to get across the Colorado River. And I want you to look up there in the upper right-hand corner at Lee's Ferry, and I'm going to trace out these 280 miles from Lee's Ferry to Pierce Ferry. It's interesting to think that if there was an imaginary highway along the Colorado River and you were driving along that highway at 70 miles an hour, it would still take you 4 long hours to drive through the Grand Canyon going at that high rate of speed. Typically on a motor trip, you can go through in 7 or 8 days. And on an oar trip, it takes anywhere from 12 to 16 days. That's a long way to go. So we better get started on this river trip. Now, Lee's Ferry is considered River Miles 0.0. And this is a convention that was started by the US Geological Survey back in the past century. And the river miles are measured downstream through the Grand Canyon from this point. So if you hear me say river mile 150 or 179, that is the distance downstream from Lee's Ferry. And it's a little bit unfortunate that the river trip has to start at Lee's Ferry because it's such a wonderful area. And here's a picture of the Lee's Ferry area that I took from a cliff up above it. And you can look down there to the boat ramp, and this is where the Grand Canyon starts. But I want to draw your attention to that cliff up there in the upper right called the Vermilion Cliffs. When you start the river trip at Grand Canyon, this is the last time you'll see the Vermilion Cliffs until you go all the way over to the west of Las Vegas, Nevada. And that's where you can see these layers of rock again. So between the Vermilion Cliffs at Lee's Ferry and all the way to Las Vegas, these younger rocks that sit on top of the Grand Canyon rocks cannot be seen. And you might wonder how that is. Look at this space photograph of the Grand Canyon from space. You can see the Vermilion and Echo Cliffs over there on the right. I couldn't even fit the red rocks of Las Vegas onto this. And it's this uplift of the Kaibab upwarp, which I'm outlining for you right here. That green color you see to the upwarp is actually the higher elevations where the pine trees and the spruce trees grow. And when this plateau was uplifted, that caused the layers that used to extend up and over the Grand Canyon region to be eroded away. We still see them in the areas that were not uplifted at the Vermilion Cliffs and over near Las Vegas. But between these two areas, this massive amount of rock strata has been eroded away. Well, we're going to get downstream on our virtual trip here. We've already gone a half a mile down from Lee's Ferry. And one of the first interesting things you start to see is this whitish layer that begins to perk up from beneath the riverbed. And this is a rock unit called the Kaibab limestone. And if you've ever been fortunate enough to visit the South Rim or the North Rim of Grand Canyon, this is the layer where that yellow line is, where the hotels are built. I know that sounds incredible, but these layers rise up as you go downstream. And in fact, when you're just 70 miles from Lee's Ferry, look at where the Kaibab limestone is located, more than a mile above the Colorado River. So not only is the river chiseling down through the rock layers at a rate of about 8 feet per mile, but the rocks themselves are rising up from the tilt that they have due to this upwarp. And by the time you get here to Desert View and you see the watchtower, you're a mile deep in the earth and the Colorado River is flowing beneath you. Now, one of the first things you see on the river are Navajo bridges where US Highway 89A crosses over the upper part of the Grand Canyon. You see 2 bridges there. The one on the upstream side towards the photographer was built in 1929, and then the newer bridge was built just in 1995 for larger vehicle traffic. But when you go under Navajo bridges, you see one of the very first layers called the Coconino Sandstone. And here you see a boat floating by the Coconino Sandstone. Notice all of those lines in the sandstone that are tilting down at an angle. That's the preservation of ancient sand dunes. And all of the layers in the Grand Canyon preserve evidence for what the past environments have been. And if you're lucky enough to go down the Grand Canyon with a geologist or somebody who knows about the rock layers, you'll learn that there's been shallow seas, desert dunes, river deltas, floodplains, all different kinds of environments are represented by these rocks. Just a short distance down from here, we typically will stop at one of the Coconino sandstone outcrops and see where this ancient reptile crawled up one of the dunes. And this is such good preservation of the footprints. You can actually see the claws at the front of the appendages as they sank into the soft sand. And one of the neat things to do if you're lucky enough to live in geologic time is that you can imagine what these landscapes were like by looking at current places on planet Earth, like this dune deposit that's in the country of Namibia in South Africa. And I've been lucky enough to go to this place where these sandy dunes are blowing into the Atlantic Ocean. And this is a perfect modern analog for the Coconino sandstone 275 million years ago. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the way that you can go down the river. Really, when people ask me, Wayne, I want to go down the river, what's the best time to go? What's the best way to go? The first thing I tell people is, how long do you want to go for? And then I say, do you want to go on a motor trip or an oar trip? So here you can see one of these 18-foot oar boats with 10-foot oars. And the oar trips tend to be a lot quieter. They tend to be longer because you're not using a motor. And they're closer to the water. That means you get more wet in an oar boat. And it's a more natural way to go down. And I've done many, many oar trips. And it's a wonderful way to go down if you have the time to do it. Another way to go is to take one of these larger boats where we fit about 10 or 11 people. These trips tend to be shorter. They're slightly less expensive because they are shorter and they're farther from the water. You can still get wet, as I will show you later on in the slide program. And the reason that I use these for the museum trips is because it facilitates more group learning. If you have 11 people on the boat here, I can be on the boat and I can point out everything that we're passing by. On an oar boat, I'm only on the boat with about 2 or 3 people during the day, and then I try to bring everybody else up to speed. So there's pros and cons to both ways to go. I prefer the motor trips for educational trips. And here you can see me pointing out some of the sites as we're making our way down the upper part of Grand Canyon. It's a fun way to go, and I want to introduce you now to the idea that river trips are really meant to be a vehicle to see the inner parts of the Grand Canyon. So we do lots of side hikes. And that's the one thing that I look forward to the most, is taking these many, many side hikes away from the river into beautiful waterfalls or Indian ruins or springs. Now, a lot of times we'll tell people, people will ask, how long is this hike? And we'll tell them this hike is 1.5 miles long round trip. And they go, oh, that's easy. I do that at home every morning. Well, you can see that a Grand Canyon hike, these are Grand Canyon miles, and they always involve irregular terrain and clambering up rocks. And you can see somebody moving up here and climbing. A lot of times, if you're lucky enough, you go in the springtime and you can see these beautiful wildflowers. When we do our trips with the museum, we always try to go in May so that we catch the wildflowers. And you'll hear me talk a lot about the geology tonight, but there's all different kinds of things to see in the Grand Canyon. This, for example, is a place where an ancient plant was growing, and these are the remnants of the roots that were growing in the soil some 312 million years ago. They're called root casts. And you can see where this tree was growing in the floodplain of the river right there. Now, we mostly go up in this side canyon in North Canyon to see these beautiful pools. And at the very end, there's this reflecting pool with these very nicely textured rocks. And it really is a highlight, especially for photographers and geologists to take this hike. One of the things you'll see going back down is this incredible texture in the rocks going down. And Let me see if I can explain this to you very simply, how this pattern is formed. You'll notice that this is a U-shaped canyon. The flash floods have come down here and carved out this solid rock. Well, when that rock was removed, there was a confining pressure in the rest of the rock wall that was released, and the rocks pop out just a little bit into that open space. And you'll notice that the fracture pattern in these rocks parallels the shape of the canyon. And that tells us that this beautiful pattern in the rocks has formed in a process known as exfoliation, where you create an open space, the confining pressure that kept the rock held tightly is removed, and the rocks pop out perpendicular to that open space. And that's one of the highlights of going in North Canyon. Look at this. We're only 32 miles downstream from Lee's Ferry, and we're already half a mile in the earth. We're going down through all of these different layers, and this is a layer called the Red Wall limestone. Now, this limestone is a deposit from a time when there was a vast epicontinental sea in the western part of the United States, so there's lots of fossils. And here's some corals that are found in the Red Wall. Look at this beautiful nautiloid. And it was actually the curator of geology at the Museum of Northern Arizona who discovered this outcrop in the 1970s. And you might not know what a nautiloid is. It's very closely related to octopus and squid. Here's a picture of that particular creature. And this squid-like animal lives and has all these chambers in it. It only lives out of that upper end of the shell that you see there. So we come to mile 33, and this is a very tightly spaced area with 3 beautiful attraction sites: Stanton's Cave, Vasey's Paradise, and Red Wall Cavern. Now, Stanton's Cave is a place that you cannot visit because it's so rich in archaeological and paleontological resources that the Park Service has put up a bat-friendly gate. In the old days, prior to 1969, you could go in there, but it was in 1969 when a scientific study was done. By the way, I want to point out to you that the cave entrance is 144 feet above the modern river. Keep that in mind as I show you these next few slides. Here's one of the black and white pictures from this 1969 survey, and that's Dr. Robert Euler on the right, who conducted this survey when it was discovered that there were incredible archaeological finds in this cave. I have gone down the river with Dr. John Ware, who was a young graduate student with Dr. Euler and was involved with this study. And what they did is they dug 2 trenches about 5 feet deep. You can see the trench outlined there. And what they found about 2.5 feet down was a layer of driftwood. And think to yourself, 144 feet above the river, how did this driftwood get there? Well, the results from the study were pretty exciting. They found 84 split twig figurines that were made by people of almost 4,100 years ago. You know, this would have been at the end times for when the Great Pyramids in Egypt were being built. There were actually hunters and gatherers living in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and they made these figurines out of willow sticks. The driftwood that was found in the trenches was radiocarbon dated to about 43,000 years old, well within the time of the Ice Age. And then they also found fossils of 2 extinct animals, Harrington's mountain goat, Miriam teratorn. The teratorn, the bird, was dated at 15,000 years before the present. And they also found fossil evidence for the California condor, the turkey, coyote, gray fox, ringtail cat, raccoon, bighorn sheep, horse, camel, and river otters. This was just an incredible find that they did not expect since they originally went in there for archaeological reasons. And here is one of these split twig figurines that's about 4,100 years old. Here's a diagram to show you some of the ones that were pulled out in this study. And I'll just draw your attention to the top 2 on the left. You can actually see how they curled the twig to make the horns of the bighorn sheep look real. Now, sometimes there's been hundreds of these found in other caves in the Grand Canyon, and they're all about 4,000 years old. Sometimes these ancient hunters and gatherers would put a modern fecal pellet in the cavity of the torso sometimes there was a sharpened bone going through the torso. And so archaeologists believe that these split twig figurines were some kind of way to invoke hunting magic for these hunters and gatherers. Yeah. If you made an offering to the gods, that you had a successful hunt, that you could get one of these bighorn sheep. Just an incredible find. Here's an image of the Teratorn. Now, this was a giant bird that had a wingspan 11 to 10 feet. We think that it probably lived a lot like the California condor does, being a scavenger. But with a beak like that, scientists have thought that maybe it was more than a scavenger and maybe he was making his own food. So fossils of these have been found in the Grand Canyon. Just slightly downstream from the cave is Vasey's Paradise, where the water just pours out of the wall. Really spectacular site, named by a botanist, by John Wesley Powell back in the 1860s. Look at this picture right here. You see the two springs. This is typically a lot what Vasey's Paradise looks like at the end of summer now, because of the way that the climate is changing here in the American Southwest. The aquifer back in the rocks is becoming depleted just a little bit, and that's kind of unfortunate. Now we're approaching Red Wall Cavern, again, just half a mile down from Vasey's Paradise. John Wesley Powell said that 50,000 people could fit in this cavern. By the way, it's not truly a cavern. A cavern is a place where you lose natural light. This is not that deep. It would be more properly called an alcove in the rocks, but we still call it Red Wall Cavern. Look at this picture very closely, and now I'll show you a picture I took in 1983 when the river was running at a very high level, and you can see the whole back of the cave is filled with floodwater from the Colorado River. And yes, that is a single kayaker floating in the back of Red Wall Cave. When I show this picture to modern river runners, they just can't believe the river got that high. We measure the river in CFS, that means cubic feet per second. Typically, the river will run 10 to 18,000 today. This was at 93,000. And when you're in the cave, you can take these beautiful silhouette pictures looking back out to the Grand Canyon. Just lovely views everywhere you go along on the river trip. You'll see a lot of springs coming out of the limestone rocks in the Grand Canyon. And here we're floating by one. You can see the beautiful monkey flowers that are growing at the top of this spring. But below those vegetation there, what you're actually looking at is an apron of travertine that has formed from the spring water running out of the bedrock for thousands and thousands of years. And you see the little hole at the bottom. The spring is actually inside that hole, spilling down into the river. This is an apron that sticks out from the wall. And whenever you find these springs, you can see these beautiful things like maidenhair ferns. The Museum of Northern Arizona is the home of this Spring Institute, and I'm very proud of that, that the Museum of Northern Arizona has an institute as part of its mission to really study springs all over the world, but especially in the United States and in the American Southwest. Now, I want to talk about these monsoon waterfalls. And occasionally, if you go down in Arizona summertime, we get this moisture coming up from the south. And I always tell my people, if we happen to be down there in the Grand Canyon in July or August or September, it'll start to rain really heavily. And I will already tell people, maybe it'll rain hard enough, we'll see these waterfalls. And when it happens, the water cannot sink into the solid rock, and it just runs off the cliff right down into the river in these big red waterfalls. And people often say, Wayne, are they going to happen? I say, give it a few more minutes. Usually about 25 minutes of a hard rain, you'll start to see things like this. Just absolutely phenomenal. So even though it's hot in the Grand Canyon in the middle of the summer, that's also our rainy season, and that's a chance to see these monsoon waterfalls. By the way, that's how a lot of these rocks that are normally gray, like the Red Wall limestone, when these waterfalls happen, you can see that red mist that is being generated into the air around that. That red mist will rest onto the gray wall of limestone and actually coat it and make it turn red. One of the next places at River Mile 52 is Nankoweap Canyon. And Nankoweap Canyon is interesting, and it's a big, broad area. Look at this wall across the way. This is interesting for a number of reasons, but if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see the delta of Nankoweap Creek. And that delta is pushing the river into that wall you see here in the image. And through time, that delta just keeps pushing, pushing, pushing farther into the wall. And that wall has become oversteepened. So one of my favorite things to do is to camp at Nankoweap and watch the sunset on this west-facing wall. And it's just a beautiful sight. Now, most people who don't have any interest in geology yet, what they will do is they will climb up to this Indian ruin. By the way, that's 3,300 feet, almost straight up going up there. You climb up to this place where you can see these granaries. Now, about 1,000 years ago, there were people living in the Grand Canyon who were agriculturalists, and they would grow corn and beans and squash. And they had these little areas up in the cliff where they would put a flat slab over that opening and store much of their seed crop in there. And the reason to climb up 700 feet to see this ruin is to get this fantastic view of the Colorado River looking downstream. This is all at Nankoweap. You can see the camp down there in the lower part of the photograph. You can see that big raft. Hopefully you can. That's a 33-foot long raft, and it shrinks to insignificance here in the Grand Canyon. You see this view right here, and you may remember that the US Mint put out quarters for all the national parks. This is the view that appeared on Grand Canyon's quarter, and you can see it right there. It's the view from Nankoweap and those ruins right there. The next stop is the Little Colorado River at River Mile 61. There's a major tributary in the Grand Canyon. This tributary is about 175 miles long, but only the lower 13 miles of it has water in it year round. And look at the water that's in the Little Colorado River. This is coming out of one of the large springs. It's called Blue Springs for some reason. I don't know how it got that name, but Blue Springs is supplying all of this water in the Little Colorado River. And to take a hike up here and to see the contrast between the turquoise blue water and the red rocks is really exciting. We just walk up a half a mile and find a place where there's a deep pool and we go swimming. The water is relatively warm compared to the Colorado River. And so that's a big joy when you're on the river trip. Now that blue color is a little bit deceiving. The water is actually clear, but it's got dissolved limestone in it, and the dissolved limestone is refracting the shorter wavelengths of light back to your eye. So if you had a glass of that water, it would be clear, but when you get so much of it with so much of the dissolved limestone in there, it gives this blue color. Let me talk a little bit about camping and domestic life on the river. It's very, very easy, in my opinion. And most people who have hesitation going down the river soon lose that hesitation when you realize we're camping on these beautiful sandy beaches every night. People are supplied tents if they want them, but it rains so rarely in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, we recommend that people sleep out. And so this would be a typical setup on a motor trip. You can see this woman is showing off her boudoir this evening, and she's sleeping on a cot, and there's a sleeping bag. She's got some clothes out to dry. And this is a typical camp scene. The boatmen, meanwhile, are making dinner, and who knows what's in these Dutch ovens. It could be a lasagna or enchiladas. If it's for dessert that night, it might be a chocolate cake or a brownie or something like that. Very easy camping on the river. And we typically will sit in a chair circle at night and tell some stories about the river or river history, geology, archaeology, botany. All kinds of things can be discussed when you're sitting right along the river, looking at the river at night. We get artists and photographers and singers and guitar players, and people come down the river. This is a well-known artist here in Flagstaff, Dawn Sutherland. Her and her husband Stan are supporters of the museum, and they came on a trip. People love to do yoga and do their morning home routines in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's just wonderful. And then in the morning, you pack everything up into these waterproof bags. Things go back onto the boat. It takes probably half an hour to pack up. Before we leave the beach, though, you might want to find out what's happening for the day. Here you see me talking to the group just before we get on the boats, and I've got the geologic map out of the Grand Canyon and talk about some of the places that we're going to visit that day and how long the hikes might be and what we're going to see, how the Grand Canyon formed, things like that. Just when you get below Desert View, it's very wide along the river. And the reason it's wide and you can see a long ways is because the rock unit that's exposed along the river is very soft, so it erodes back more readily away from the river. Yeah, when that happens, you get these fantastic views. This is Comanche Point looming over the river down there at the bottom. But things are going to change quickly because we get out of the sedimentary rocks, and just as we start to approach Phantom Ranch, the granite gorge begins. And at this depth, the Grand Canyon is a mile deep. We've actually gone down through 4,000 feet of rock layers, and we hit the basement rocks. We hit the bottommost rocks there ever can be, and they're famous rocks called the Vishnu schist and Zoroaster granite. The river has eroded them into fantastic shapes in many places. These are called potholes, where a pebble will get into a small depression, and when the river floods, that pebble just goes around and starts to chisel its way down. I haven't mentioned anything yet about rapids. I know a lot of people think that the Grand Canyon is full of rapids, but really only about 9% of the whole length of the river has rapids or riffles. And here we are getting ready to run Sockdolager Rapid, and the waves can be big. And yes, even in a motorboat, you can get quite wet. But you know, with the temperatures the way it are, it's not a problem. And the river is usually very green and clean. One of my favorite places is to pass by Point Sublime. Now, Point Sublime, you can see up there in the upper right-hand corner. And my lovely wife, Helen, we did a trip out to Point Sublime a few years ago. When I'm on these river trips, I always tell people, God, if I could just do one thing for you, it would be to wish we had a helicopter and I could fly you up there to Point Sublime and you could see what you're floating through. Well, because we're doing a virtual river trip, I've got that helicopter. And here we are at Point Sublime, and the yellow arrow there just points out where that previous photograph was taken. And you get so deep in the Grand Canyon sometimes, you don't really know what you're floating through. But as you can see, it's the Grand Canyon out there, all right. Again, this is another fantastic hike that we sometimes do. This is in a place called Shinnemoo Creek, and we always like to pull over by the banks and walk places to go to specific sites. The history in the Grand Canyon is not always prehistoric. Where those folks were hiking was about a 3-mile hike over to a place called Shinnemoo Gardens. And this is one of the pioneers in Grand Canyon, William Wallace Bass, came out from St. Louis as a young tubercular. His doctor told him to go out west and live the rest of his days in fresh air. And he established a whole camp down here. And of course, nobody's going to backpack these tools out. These tools have been there for more than 120 years. And it's just wonderful to visit sites like this in the Grand Canyon. We also will stop at waterfalls. Here's a place, the typical hiking in the Grand Canyon. This hike is only about 1/3 of a mile long, but it's irregular terrain. It's a little bit rocky. It can be slippery, but we usually get most people there. And this is the reward at the end. We go to this lovely little waterfall that has these travertine boulders and this delicate water pouring over and all the riverine vegetation growing by the side there. One of the favorite stops for geologists is Blacktail Canyon. And Blacktail Canyon is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a slot canyon. You've heard a lot about slot canyons in the American Southwest. These canyons have just been chiseled by large floods that gather in the upstream portions of the canyon and then rush down here. But the reason that the geologists like to stop, this is where we can see the great unconformity, where the Tapete sandstone sits on top of the Vishnu schist. And at that contact, 1,250 million years of the rock record is missing. Now, I did not say that all of that time was missing. There was no gap in time. There's a gap in the rock record. And incredible to think that the Vishnu schist was already 1,250 million years old when that Tapete sandstone was washed in there by a shallow sea that was encroaching on that eroded landscape. I want to introduce you to two friends of mine now. And these two friends are those colorful beds that I'm highlighting for you. You can see them there in the middle of the Bright Angel Shale. The reason I point these out is these very gold colored layers of limestone. They will be present in all of the places downstream from this point, and you can always tell where you are in the stack of rocks by looking for these two layers. And they certainly are gold. Look at where the boulders have fallen down from the cliff above and are laying in this rocky beach next to the Colorado River. Now, this is going to be a fantastic side hike. This side hike involves 3 places, and it can be broken up into 2 different hikes. If you do the whole hike, 11 miles long, and there's hardly any river trip that does that, but you can take a full day and do that. But we'll go to Thunder River, Surprise Valley, and Deer Creek. Now, this is Thunder River. You can see the picture here. And again, this is one of those Grand Canyon springs where the water just pours out of the rocks. The water's been coming through the rocks for years and years and years. This spring, to my knowledge, never gets any less than what you see. And look at the vegetation that pops up out of the ground once you get water in the desert. One of the interesting things, you can see the people walking towards Thunder River in the center of this, but right above their heads is a very interesting deposit that was formed when a giant landslide let loose and filled in this part of the Grand Canyon. In fact, if you go above Thunder River and you make your way through Surprise Valley and Cogswell Butte, there's a geologic study that has just come out in the last 6 months that says that this valley was the course of the Colorado River prior to about 900,000 years ago. And a giant landslide came down here, filled in Surprise Valley, and the river has now carved a new channel for itself on the left-hand side of Cogswell Butte. Just tremendous geologic features to see here on really large scales in the Thunder River area. Just to talk a little bit more about these landslides, here's where there's an old channel of the Colorado River filled by a different landslide. And when you're going on the river trip, you go right around that. Now, the river used to go right through that place right there, but now it's cut a new canyon over here. Because if the Colorado River had a motto, the motto would be no obstacles allowed. Anytime an obstacle is put down along the Colorado River, the river finds a way through the obstacle and establishes its course once again. Now, it's probably more than a human lifetime that it establishes its course, but it's not millions of years. It's not hundreds of thousands of years. It's not even tens of thousands of years. The river will establish a new course probably in just decades or 100 years. And then we finally get to Deer Creek, another place where there's 2 big springs. And of course, wherever there's springs in the desert, we get the cottonwood trees. And here you see our group walking back on the ledges, back from Deer Creek, and you get these beautiful views of the river. You've just come down. A summer monsoon storm is brewing on the horizon there. And down at the base of Deer Creek, this is a very unusual place for the river trip because this is where about a 180-foot waterfall pours right down into the river. And again, it's landslides that cause this. Deer Creek has shifted its course because of a landslide, and it's currently carving out a new canyon. And we can actually watch as this new canyon is being made. A little bit further downstream, we're now very close to the Havasupai Indian Reservation. So a lot of the local names are from the Havasupai language. This is called Matkatameba Canyon. And it's a very narrow slot where people walk in the water and climb through this very narrow slot, a lot of times up to a beautiful alcove where you can see the rocks have formed a shelter that you can get under. I haven't said anything at all about wildlife. There is a lot of wildlife down the Grand Canyon. Probably the most iconic animal would be the bighorn sheep that those hunters and gatherers were hunting 4,100 years ago. But the bighorn sheep do utilize the river as a source of water. And anytime we're going through a bit of a drought, you'll see literally dozens and dozens, sometimes close to 100 bighorn sheep on your river trip. And there are lots of animals down there. You see mule deer, ringtail cats, and if you're lucky, Gila monsters. A lot of people have heard of Havasu Creek because of the beautiful blue waterfalls that can be found up near the village of Supai. But in the lower part of Havasu Creek, river runners will commonly stop. This is a lot like the Little Colorado River. We've got dissolved limestone that is refracting light and creating this beautiful blue water, typically a lot warmer than the Colorado River. And if the river is running muddy, this is a welcome clean water stop. Although Havasu Creek has experienced a number of big uh, uh, rock gouging flash floods in the last 30 years. Now we finally get to River Mile 179, and probably on your river trip, everybody's been talking about this. The excitement's been building. This is the largest rapid, considered the largest rapid along the whole course. It's a very short rapid. It's over in about 8 seconds, but here we're scouting the rapid from the right-hand bank, and you can see that a lot of boulders have washed into the river here to create this obstacle along the river. Geologists used to think that this was the remnants of a lava dam because we are entering the area of the canyon where lava has poured into the canyon. But really what's causing this is the side canyon on the opposite side of the river that's pushing these boulders in there. Again, because it's a virtual river trip, we can pop up and look at lava falls from up above. This is from the Toro Weep Overlook. You can take a 61-mile dirt road to the lip of the Grand Canyon. If you look over there on the far right, you can see a person standing out on the rock admiring lava falls. And I hope you do notice these black lava flows that are cascading down from the rim of the canyon. And these lava flows form dams along the river, all within the last 800,000 years. Geologists have documented that within the last 800,000 years, at least 17 lava dams have been built across the Colorado River. One of them may have been 2,000 feet high above the river, and that's almost as high as we are in this photograph right here. So let's get back down to lava falls, and I want to show you some of the scenes going through the rapid. You can see one of these big 32-foot boats that's making its way through the rapid. Everybody's getting wet going into some of the big holes there, and that is a fun ride going through lava falls. Let me just go backwards so we can do that one more time. I know you want to run the rapid. And here we are at the top of the rapid, and we were pulled over on the left side of the river, and I took these photographs. Again, this is one of the big motor boats going through, but all the boats make it through these kinds of rapids. And it is a very exciting run. People always want to know if they can go back and do it again, but there's no way to go back and do it again. Once you pass this spot at Lava Falls, you actually do start to see the lava right next to the river. And there's beautiful textures for the photographer to make pictures of. Here we can see some columnar jointing. When the lava finally gets down to the river channel and begins to cool, it will cool perpendicular to the cooling surface, and these beautiful columns form. Sometimes water will leak into the lava flow, and then you'll see these radiating patterns that are coming out, and the cooling is going on from a point right down below there. There might have been a lava tube that was formed in this lava flow, and the water moving through the lava tube called the hot lava above to cool in this fashion. Now, this is from my book, Carving Grand Canyon. We had the artist Bronze Black draw what one of these lava dams might have looked like. And in this particular view, you can see where a couple of cinder cones have erupted on the rim of the canyon and formed these lava dams. Now, think about it. Imagine if you had been camped here within the last 800,000 years and you happen to see one of these large reservoirs forming behind a lava dam. That 2,000-foot high dam that I spoke about, the water would have backed up all the way through where Lake Powell is today, close to Moab, Utah. There would have been a lake almost 350 miles long. Imagine you were camping there on the day when the reservoir filled and the water started to pour over the top of the dam, like we see right here. You would have seen a waterfall in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, maybe 800 or 1,000 feet high. Imagine you happened to be there the day the lava dam collapsed catastrophically. And we know that at least on 5 different occasions, these lava dams failed catastrophically and let all of the water out at once. There have been flood deposits that have been found downstream from this area that are 600 feet above the modern river, with some boulders in them that are 100 feet in diameter. It's just incredible to think that this may have happened at least 17 times. Here you can see one of these lava cascades as I'm looking back upstream. You can see where the lava is frozen right on the wall there. And then as you go downstream, you get less and less remnants of the lava. There's a remnant of the lava here on the left side of the photograph. But the longest dam in the river has been documented to go down the river channel from the lava falls area 86 miles. Can you imagine 86 miles of the Colorado River filled with lava, and then the river has to excavate its way? I tell you, when you go by this remnant today, and that remnant is about 500,000 years old, it's only 500,000 years old. The water, for the most part, is smooth as can be. The river has already done its work to ream out this lava flow. Because remember, if the Colorado River had a motto, the motto would be no obstacles allowed. Well, we finally get down to a place near Diamond Creek. This is 226 miles from Lee's Ferry. And a lot of river trips will take out at a dirt road that comes in at Diamond Creek. But I just want to show for you some of the layers of rock that we've talked about tonight. You can see them there in Diamond Peak. But if you look closely as a geologist, you can see that on the opposite side of that valley is the Vishnu Schist. Now, on the right side of the photograph, the Vishnu Schist is still in the subsurface. So what's going on here? There's a gigantic fault called the Hurricane Fault. And back in the last 10 million years, there's been 2,500 feet of offset that has put Diamond Peak down faulted right next to the rocks adjacent to it. And you probably wouldn't notice anything like this unless you were traveling with a geologist who has a hard time living in the modern world, seeing all these ancient wonders beautifully displayed in this desert landscape. Also, if you think about it, right there where that yellow line is, that's the bottom of the Redwall limestone in Diamond Peak. The elevation of that yellow line is 3,100 feet. The elevation of the river here is 1,400 feet. That's how much you've descended from Lee's Ferry when you pass Diamond Peak. The river has actually carved down 1,700 feet through that much rock to get to this spot. Well, only a few people see the lower Granite Gorge because the takeout is there at Diamond Creek, but I'm just going to finish up tonight with a few pictures of the lower Granite Gorge, because downstream from Diamond Creek, there is still 55 miles of the Grand Canyon. You can see this human ruin that's in the foreground here. This is not from prehistoric times. This is a ruin from a dam building group where they were going to put a dam all across the Colorado River in that direction you see in the background there. This was going to be Bridge Canyon Dam. And fortunately, Bridge Canyon Dam was stopped for environmental reasons, and because it's the Grand Canyon, you don't want to flood the Grand Canyon. So the water would have backed up all the way back over Lava Falls. It would have backed up into Havasu Creek. It would have backed up into Deer Creek. So fortunately, Bridge Canyon Dam was not constructed. You get to a spot downstream from here where you reach Separation Canyon, and this cenotaph has been put on the wall because, as some of you may know, on August 28th, 1869, this is when 3 members of the Powell Party decided to leave the river trip just 2 days. They had no way of knowing it was going to be only 2 days, but they left the river trip and went out what is now called Separation Canyon. And I hope you appreciate my little fun way that I put Separation Canyon there with the word separated. And it says, Seneca Howland, O.G. Howland, and William H. Dunn separated from the original Powell Party, climbed to the north, and were killed by the Indians. Now we can tell that when this was made, because there are some conflicting stories on what may have happened to those people. And we don't exactly know what happened. They were never seen again. We finally get down towards the end of the trip. And when I first started out in my career in the Grand Canyon, everything you see in this photograph was under the waters of Lake Mead. In fact, that is Lake Mead sediment that is piled up in the Grand Canyon. I put this photograph in there because you can see this cable coming out of the Lake Mead sediment. That's very, very interesting. That cable used to go to a guano mine, and they had a tramway that went from the south rim to the north side of the river. An Air Force jet hit that cable, nearly disabled the jet, but the pilot got back to Las Vegas okay. That cable was cut and dropped into the Mead Reservoir in 1962. So where you see that cable coming out of the Mead sediment, that tells you that the sediment had piled up to that level. And as a geologist, you look at those two different types of sediment there, very sandy below the cable. That was before Glen Canyon Dam was built in 1963. The cable came down, rested on the reservoir floor, then Glen Canyon was formed. And when that dam was put up, we only get the mudstone, the darker mudstone deposited on top. And here you can see a picture where I've taken the Mead sediment just eroding down, going back down the river as it should be. Lake Mead is very low right now. Here's a picture I took of the very western end of the Grand Canyon when Lake Mead did have all of this water. If you were to show this picture today, there would just be a brown river flowing down there. And those are the Grand Wash Cliffs. And the Grand Wash Cliffs mark the spectacular exit of the Colorado River out of the Grand Canyon. From the river, the Grand Wash Cliffs look like this. And again, this is a place where a gigantic fault has moved the rocks, and there's been 18,000 feet of displacement along that single fault. And it's so amazing. You come at this spot right here, the river takes a left-hand turn, and you go from the Grand Canyon into the Mojave Desert, just like that. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening with the Museum of Northern Arizona on this virtual river trip. This has been very fun to share this with all of you. And I thank those of you that are members of the Museum of Northern Arizona, and I thank you for all your support. And I thank all of the guests out there that we have tonight. The museum is a fantastic institution here on the Colorado Plateau that preserves the ethnography and the archaeology and the geology and the botany of the Colorado Plateau and surrounding areas. Now, if I've whetted your appetite at all, I've just agreed to do another river trip through the museum, and you can join me on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. You can reserve space tomorrow by calling Liz McGinley. I do want to point out this trip is being planned for May of 2022. All of my other trips for 2021 are already sold out, but I'd be happy to go down with you. And the phone number down there is 928-779-5211 at extension 227. You can talk to Liz. Send me an email. If you don't write the phone number down, I'd be happy to put you in touch with Liz. And thank you all very much for joining me tonight. And we'll see if we can answer some questions for you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Wayne. A couple of questions. First one is about how old is the Grand Canyon?
Oh, that's the big question. How old is the Grand Canyon? Oh, a big one right off the bat. You will mostly see the Grand Canyon labeled as between 5 and 6 million years. And probably that's a good estimate for the age of the Grand Canyon. But I will tell you that that age really refers to the age of the Colorado River, the modern Colorado River, as it flows from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf of California. Before the modern river came into existence 6 million years ago, there were probably some parts of the Grand Canyon that had already been carved by an ancestor to the river. So it's a little bit disingenuous by geologists to call the Grand Canyon 6 million years old, because that really refers to the age of the modern river. Some of those rocks that we saw being cut through probably were being cut through by an ancestor to the river. And we do think that the modern river was formed from two separate and distinct ancestors that were integrated through a process of either headward erosion and stream piracy or basin overspill, where a lake spilled over a lip of the canyon, or possibly by the collapse of caves with all these springs in the Grand Canyon.
Did the river carve out all of the open space we see in the canyon?
The river did not carve out all of the open space. The river is about 300 feet wide at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And we know that the river is at least responsible for that width of the canyon. But we think that the vast majority of the open space that we see in the canyon was carved by the tributaries inside the canyon. So there are literally hundreds of tributaries, and these tributaries also have big floods in them. And these tributaries are being carved as deep as the Colorado River is carving its Grand Canyon. In fact, most of the side streams in the Grand Canyon come into the river at the same level of the river. As a geologist, we say they come in at grade. Practically all of them. Of course, Deer Creek is an exception, but as we heard, that is a new canyon that's being carved because of a landslide. And you think to yourself, wow, these little tributaries, many of them that are dry all of the year, still have carved their own tributary canyons just as deep as the Colorado River has carved its canyon. And so most of that open space you see is the result from tributary side canyons carving their canyons as they meet the Colorado River.
Absolutely incredible. Thank you, Wayne. What are the different levels of the river now as compared to earlier times? And are there any big reductions because of the upstream dam?
Yes, the flow through the Grand Canyon is highly regulated. And there was a protocol that was developed in the 1920s. The river was divided into upper basin states and lower basin states, and they agreed to share the water in the river 50-50. So Lake Powell was constructed behind Glen Canyon Dam in order to deliver this water to the lower basin states. Typically during the river season, you're going to see flows anywhere between 8,000 cubic feet per second and 18,000 cubic feet per second. And then in the wintertime, when not many river runners are down there, it's a little bit less than that. So the flow of the river has been managed. And this has been sort of a detriment to the ecosystem along the river. The ecosystem has been highly affected by the construction of Glen Canyon Dam. There is also a loss of water due to evaporation sitting in the reservoirs. And of course, the withdrawals that are taken out of the river are phenomenal. You know, whether you're growing hay in Utah or Colorado, those are waters that are taken out of the river, never make it downstream. They have a right to do that, but it makes the flows a little bit less. But there is enough water to do the river trip, and that's the benefit of the dam. The benefit of the dam is that it parses out the water through droughts and holds it back in floods. So the levels are pretty much managed and very, very predictable in advance of your river trip.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your wonderful questions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them.
I may regret doing this, but you can email me if you want to ask a question.
So this is a question from Lewis C. He says, recently the use of zeolites in quartz sand as a water purifier by ancestral Native Americans provides an example of ethnogeology. Where in the Grand Canyon has evidence of ethnogeology as practiced by ancestral Puebloans been identified?
Oh, wow. Is this like Stump the Geologist night or something? The only thing I can think about, of course, the people that lived in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, whether we're talking the Pueblo Indians or the hunters and gatherers. There is evidence also that maybe the Clovis people, the oldest people in North America, may have passed through the Grand Canyon. A couple of Clovis points have been found nearby. Certainly, their factories were the rock units of the Grand Canyon, and they would use the Grand Canyon to make their arrow points. They would use chert, sometimes petrified wood from nearby areas. There's a hematite place in the bottom of the Grand Canyon where hematite was mined by the ancestral peoples for pigment. I'm not too familiar with the zeolite uh, story that was in the question, but zeolites are a mineral that are found in the lava rocks down in the Grand Canyon. I had not heard that the Native Americans may have used that to purify the water, but that's one of the neat things about the Grand Canyon. We're always learning from the Grand Canyon. And the Museum of Northern Arizona has been doing research trips in the bottom of the canyon since the early 1970s. And in fact, when you do a river trip, you will always have a chance to visit the groover, which is what the toilet on the river is conveniently called. And the idea for the modern groover was actually the result of studies from the Museum of Northern Arizona in the 1970s. And I remember very well my very first river trip in 1976. I went down with Dr. Steve Carruthers, and he went to a beach at Granite Rapid, and he dug down into the sand in the month of March where some human waste had been buried by a river trip in the previous river season, found out that the fecal coliforms were still active and alive, and he was the one who invented the groover, where a very comfortable toilet seat is put on a steel box. Kind of a bad way to end this lecture, but the museum has been down there for a long time, and the groover is a result of research by the museum in the bottom of the Grand Canyon.
That's amazing. I'd never heard that before. Thank you, Wayne.
I'll take one more question if you have it.
So we had a guest who was curious where the location of the white flowered prickle poppy that was shown in one of the earlier parts of your presentation may be. She suspects it might be the rare endemic Arizona prickle poppy.
Yeah, I don't know. To me, they're all prickle poppies, and I didn't realize there were different species of them. But that particular prickle poppy was from North Canyon at River Mile 20. And maybe there would be a botanical checklist that might know if that particular species is present that far north. You know, when you go in the Grand Canyon River trip, you go through 3 of the 4 North American deserts. And for the first 40 miles, you're in the Great Basin Desert. And then you start to go through the Sonoran Desert. And after that, below Lava Falls, you get into the Mojave Desert. So the vegetation along the river trip is striking and really something to see as you go downstream. Thank you all very, very much for supporting the museum and checking out our virtual river trip. And I hope we all get a chance to go down the river one time. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Wayne. We're going to go ahead and turn the last few minutes over to our development director, Liz McGinley, for a few closing comments.
Thank you so much again to Wayne. And I would just like to say we really appreciate the support and this opportunity to be able to do this virtually because of the time period that we're in right now. And we couldn't do it without you all. The museum, as you know, is ran on donations and support from individuals like you. And of course, this year, I would say now more than ever, we are relying on members and donors such as yourself to be able to donate to the museum. And we hope to be able to do more of this online programming for months to come if needed, and continue it even when things are back to normal, whatever that may be. So my ask tonight is that you remember us in your year-end giving, and remember us for the end of the year. We're going through a fall campaign right now, really trying to get some donations in and have a great end of year and then great start to 2021. I know the trip in 21 is going to be awesome, as well as 22. It looks like a lot of individuals are looking forward to that. So again, we appreciate your support. And I know if we can get anyone to donate tonight, you can go to our website at musenaz.org and go to donate now. And I know you'll get a big virtual hug from our awesome CEO, Mary Kershaw, and myself. And we always thank you so very much for supporting us. Have a good evening.